Right guys, welcome back. In this video we're going to tackle 3 essays on holism and reductionism. The first one's going to be a bog standard essay on the topic, but the second and third will be 2 slightly horrible essays, both of which have come up in exams in the last few years and have caused quite a few problems. With all 3 essays we're going to cover a plan so that you can have a go at writing it yourself if you want to, and then we'll go through the whole model essay after that. If you need a bit more practice on holism and reductionism in general, then have a look at the video that's linked at the top of your screen now, and you can go through the whole lesson if you want to. And finally, before we get started, if you find this video useful, a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. So let's get right into it with our first essay. This is the bog standard essay where you're going to be asked about both holism and reductionism. The only thing to really keep in mind here is that it's a discuss essay, which means that you need to argue both sides of the debate. So as you can see from the plan, we're going to keep it nice and simple. Introduce the debate, and then we're going to jump in with holism first because I'm not planning to say much about it, just briefly what it is, and then I'll reference an example, which in this essay is going to be the humanistic approach. You could of course use something different like Gestalt psychology if you wanted to, it's completely up to you. I'm then going to move on to reductionism, and there's quite a lot that you could say about reductionism, so you need to be a little bit picky about what you're going to include. I'm going to cut out the levels of explanation and focus rather on the types of reductionism instead. This is a personal choice and there's nothing wrong with doing it the opposite way or even including both if you really want to. It just depends on your confidence with the topic and how much you think you can write in the time. My evaluation section is going to be made up of 4 points. These 4 points are going to follow us through for the next 2 essays as well. So these are kind of the points that you can use and reuse for the majority of holism and reductionism questions. So the first 3 are going to center very much around mental illness, simply because they feed into each other quite nicely. And then the 4th point is going to be something a little bit different. Now remember, with issues and debates, a strength of one approach is very often a limitation of the other, so just spend a minute thinking about the order of your points. Very often you can arrange them in such a way that they flow very nicely from one to the next, creating this nice little flow of counterpoints, which is really nice to read and that examiners really enjoy seeing in an essay. So let's go through the individual points and then I'll show you the whole essay at the end. So here is the outline. You've got 4 paragraphs. The first one is an introduction to the debate. The second one is holism, including an example. Then you've got 1 paragraph about reductionism and 1 final paragraph about the types of reductionism. Evaluation point 1 is a limitation of holism and how it's too complex for use in the development of therapies, which is then followed by evaluation point 2, which is sort of a counterpoint that says reductionism doesn't have that problem. I've also used research by Sumro as an example to highlight my point in this evaluation. That's an evaluation point from the OCD topic from year 1, and if you can't remember it, I'll link the topic on your screen now so you can go back and you can have a look at what that's all about if you want to. Evaluation point 3 is another counterpoint, which is a limitation of the reductionist approach and argues that reductionism takes a viewpoint that's too narrow and it ignores the context of the behavior, which is very important. Now, before we move on to the final point, just consider what has just been done with those 3 evaluation points. We started with a limitation of the holistic approach, followed by an opposing strength of reductionism, followed by a limitation of reductionism, which is actually a strength of holism. Okay, so we have 3 evaluation points that are point, counterpoint, counterpoint. They all are kind of related, and put together, they create a really nice flow of points. Okay, so this is what I meant before with have a little think about what order you want to put your evaluation points in. Okay, and then finally, the 4th point is a limitation of reductionism, and it argues that sometimes you can only take a holistic approach because some behaviors can only be understood at the holistic level. Therefore, reductionist explanations become pointless. Okay, and then take all of those points, and this is what the full essay would look like. Okay, so that was the first essay. We're now going to move on to the first of our two gross essays, and this one was from the 2020 paper 3. Now, there are two things that make this essay gross. Firstly is the focus on reductionism only. Second, it asks you to refer to the statement in your answer, which means that it's an application question. So this is how we are going to do it. In our outline, we're going to talk about reductionism first and explain the basic concept. We're going to make sure that we use keywords like parsimony because it's going to help us get straight to the point without waffling and losing focus. We're then going to introduce the idea of levels of explanation. We're not going to use any full examples here, but rather just explain what we mean. We're then going to finish off with types of reductionism and explain what both biological and environmental reductionism are. In terms of our evaluation points, we're going to basically use the same ones as earlier. We're just going to cut out the first one, which was a limitation of holism, and we don't need that in this essay. Now, to apply it, we can't just talk about an approach or a topic and then be done with it, because the STEM wants us to specifically talk about why reductionism is considered more scientific. So we have to explain why that's the case, and we can use a topic to help us do that, but the focus has to be on why reductionism is more scientific. Okay, so we need to make sure that we use key words and concepts to explain why that's the case. So things like operationalizing variables, objectivity, cause and effect, empirical research, the scientific method, that type of stuff. All those concepts and all those key words are going to be really important to help us get our point across. There are all kinds of examples that you could use. You could talk about depression or OCD or any other kind of condition. You could just talk about mental illness in general if you wanted to. It doesn't really matter, but whatever example you use, make sure it's one that will help you argue the point that reductionism is more scientific. So let's have a look at the different elements of the essay. Here's the outline. The first and the last paragraphs are pretty much the same as in the previous essay, but I've added in the middle paragraph, which is all about levels of explanation. That's your application section, and as you can see, I've tried to use as many keywords as possible to explain why reductionism is scientific, whilst also using an example to illustrate what I mean. Okay, I've kept the example quite vague, and I've just talked about explaining mental illness using biological units like levels of neurotransmitters. Okay, and then like I said earlier, you've kind of got the same evaluation points as before. You've got the first one, which is reductionism is practical, followed by the second one, arguing that it oversimplifies complex behaviors. And then the third one is the point about how some behaviors can only be understood from a holistic point of view. And altogether, the essay looks like that. Okay, and here is our final gross essay. This one came up in the 2023 paper 3, and it threw people massively. The reason this was such a hard essay is because you have to write a 16 marker on just one element of reductionism, which is levels of explanation. In addition to that, it's also an application question. So you need to take a minute and think about how you're going to do it, because you need to stretch a fairly small part of holism and reductionism into a full 16 marker. So our outline is going to, of course, only cover levels of explanation. We're going to do a brief introduction to reductionism, and then we're going to explain how reductionism varies in intensity and that some explanations are more reductionist than others. We're then going to introduce the concept of the hierarchy of explanations, known as the levels of explanations, and we're going to describe each level using examples where necessary. In terms of our application, we're going to use depression just because. You could use other examples if you wanted to, it doesn't really matter. You just need to be able to apply each level to your example. Now, here is the problem. The A-level psychology course doesn't cover all potential explanations that could come up in levels of explanation. So, for example, in year 1 you cover psychological explanations, for example cognitive explanations, or you cover biological explanations. You don't cover both for the same condition. In year 2 you cover a little bit more, so you'll cover biological and psychological explanations, which makes it a little bit easier, but social and cultural explanations are not specifically covered anywhere in the syllabus. So you need to make sure that as part of your revision for this topic, you have some solid examples in your mind and you know how you're going to explain these examples at each level. You can use depression, OCD, memory, schizophrenia, crime, stress, aggression. It's completely up to you. Just make sure that you have an example ready to go. You can use the lesson on holism and reductionism, which I'll link at the end of this video so that you can get a couple of examples if you need to, or you can just go back through your notes or through the lessons that you've covered and create your own examples. That's fine, as long as you have them and you can use them correctly. So finally, before we have a look at the full essay, here are the evaluation points. Again, they're going to be the same as we used earlier. The only difference is that we're going to tweak the wording a little bit, and instead of referring to reductionism, we're going to refer to lower or higher levels of reductionism. For example, the lower levels of explanation lead to the development of treatments. However, they have also been criticized for being overly simplistic. Okay? That's how you make these evaluation points relevant to this topic. Okay, let's have a look at the essay. Here is the outline, and here you can see in bold and underlined all of the elements that I talked about in the plan. You've then got the application section. So like I said, we are going to use depression in this essay, and highlighted on the screen now are the different levels at which depression can be explained, starting with the lower levels of explanation where the focus is on serotonin, then moving on to psychological explanations where the focus is on irrational thoughts, and then ending with the least reductionist explanation, which would be labeling theory as an example of social and cultural explanations. Again, the evaluation points stay the same, except for the reference to higher or lower levels of explanation as opposed to reductionism and holism. So here is the first one, followed by the limitation of lower levels of explanation because they oversimplify complex behavior. And then the final one, a problem with all levels of reductionism, is that some behaviors can only be understood at the much higher levels, i.e. at the holistic level. Okay, and if you take all of those points, then you are left with an essay that looks like this. Okay, and with that, we come to the end of the video. I hope it's all made sense. Keep practicing your essays because they always make up a lot of marks in the exams. If you have any questions, please stick them in the comment section below. And also, if you'd like me to cover a specific essay or a specific series of essays, you can also pop that in the comment section below. I hope it's been useful. Thank you very much for listening, and I will see you in the next one.